We're going to spend this lecture looking at the First World War and its impact on the church. And one of the reasons for this lecture is that so very often the context of the 20th century, with so many of the wars and the fights and all of the nationalism that came with it, feels so very normal in the context of the modern world. For anyone alive today, the instinct is always to believe that nations have always been fighting over turf wars, they've always been fighting over resources and energy, and that there have always been political and ideological differences that drive nations to engage with war, sometimes not only with each other, but also bringing in their allies to the point that you have global strife and what feels like a global catastrophe on the verge, particularly when you get into the era of atomic and chemical warfare. And the church had a role to play in this whole process. But we do want to say at the outset that what we're dealing with now is more how the church engaged, at times supported, and eventually came to have criticisms of the way that the world engaged in its own hostilities and its fights. In other words, while in times in the past, whenever we're looking at very sensitive problems, things like the Crusades or some of the wars in the Middle Ages or even in the modern world, at times we're having to deal with the fact that the church was either instrumental in causing the fight or at times was very much on the front lines defending one side or the other as it went to war. When we're looking at the First World War and later when we look at the Second World War, we're not talking about as much of an involvement with the church with the culture at large here. By the early 1900s, of course, the church still has a role to play, still is a voice in culture. But it would be wrong in the extreme to suggest that the church either propelled the First World War or that it had some central role to play as each side came into conflict with each other. No, often what we're dealing with here in the First and Second World War is a church on either side, whether Catholic or Protestant, that is attempting to stress, some good, some bad, either the need for the cessation of hostilities, though in most cases, the church played a role in supporting the cultural energy, you might say, needed to propel people to enlist and to go off to war. So while we're going to be looking at some sensitive problems, some of the issues where the church gets a bit too in bed with the political regimes yet again, what we're talking about here is, again, not so much an issue of the church instigating problems, but rather the church coming to a conclusion eventually that it's going to have some serious conversations internally about how it supports or rejects some of the cultural issues of their day. So as we come into the 20th century, we can go ahead and give the context here. What we're looking at is an ongoing evolution of fights that began 4 centuries before the actual outbreak of the First World War. The war, of course, begins officially on the 28th of July, 1914. And the cause of the First World War was the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, the heir to the Austrian-Hungarian line. The war then ends on the 11th of November, 1918. And this was a very serious war. When the guns finally went silent, and when the peace treaties were finally signed, some 9 million to 10 million soldiers and service people had lost their lives. Also, somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 million citizens throughout Europe had lost their lives. We are, in other words, talking about one of the more serious loss of life in the entirety of Western or even world history itself. And there are a number of factors that caused this serious number of fatalities in the First World War. The first, of course, is the fact that we have all of the major players of Europe and around the world contributing, some to a greater, some to lesser extents, troops to fight in the great trench wars there in Europe. And we'll get into some of the complexities of the war here in a minute. But what's going on is millions and millions of people are coming together from around the world to fight these fights. Other nations are drawn in, sometimes more or less against their will, but you have this clashing of enormous manpower. In fact, the First World War is one of the last wars that still feels at times very much like an older, maybe 18th or 17th century fight. You still have, for example, men charging in on horseback into the battlefield. What's changing, though, here in the early 1900s is as a result of the technological revolution, there are a number of advances in chemical and biological warfare that allow for, in particular, gassing of troops there on the front lines. This is one of the main reasons why the Germans were often propagandized as being so awful and heinous and the epitome of the Antichrist, because they were amongst the first to wait for the wind to be blowing downwind onto their enemies, and then they would release a number of chemical or nerve gas agents that would then disperse themselves amongst all these troops in the trenches, and you had enormous loss of life as a result. Now, all sides eventually engage in this type of warfare, but the enormity of this problem, the so-called problem of weapons of mass destruction that we hear so much about in the modern world, was really only beginning to rear its head here in the First World War. And so you have this amazing juxtaposition of, on the one hand, the older style of warfare, which involved a lot of charges, almost literally men throwing themselves against walls of other men, as well as a real serious leap forward in terms of the technology of mass destruction to the use of all types of different chemicals, as well as advances in terms of bullets, machine gunnery, shells and mortars, these types of things. And so the First World War is one of the more important and disastrous wars to come upon Europe and the world itself. The great problem with the First World War, though, is that for everyone that was participating, or at least nearly everyone participating, they saw this as the utopian, as Woodrow Wilson called it, war to end all wars. They honestly believed that this war and the complexity of it, the extent to which all the nations were coming together to fight, that if they won, that if the Allied powers won, that in the end, this would bring an end to war itself. In part, that explains the complexity of the First World War in its relationship to the Church. As the different powers arose, the Church often found itself pitching the fight, as a black and white either or, between either the good side or the bad side. Now, this is true of all wars, of course, at least until probably the Vietnam War, where you begin to see people on both sides saying that either side has problems or evil, and that the war should just simply stop on its own. And ever since then, of course, at least in the Western culture, anytime there is a war, anytime there's a fight, it doesn't matter what the cause or what the issue, there's always going to be people who decry and condemn it as simply totalitarian. Well, in the First World War, you might say the West and the world itself had not learned the lesson of using totalitarian propaganda, black and white propaganda, either or propaganda, when it came to the annihilation of one's enemies. So as the war gets going in 1914, what you see arise are a number of challenges to the way that the Church would engage with the First World War. You might say that the First World War is the real growing up of the Church in the 20th century. For so very long, the Church had always been involved to a greater or lesser extent with the culture around it. They were preachers in the American Revolution, preachers in wars here and there all throughout the centuries. And there had been preachers in the Civil War as well, who had instilled on one side or the other a certain perspective on the gospel and how it ought to be applied to the challenge around it. You might say that the problem wasn't so much as to what the gospel is. They all, by and large, throughout American history, believed that the Church was founded on the sacrifice of Christ on the cross for our sins. The challenge isn't so much whether or not Christ is our Savior, but very often in the Church, particularly in the context of the West, in the last, say, century and a half, the question is, what does the gospel do to make a difference to our engagement with the world around us? Does it cause us to get more involved, or does it cause us to get less involved with whatever politics or issue that is going on right now? You might say that even in the 21st century, the Church has not quite come to grips as to what the answer is as to our engagement with the challenges of the world. And the advent of social media has only made us more aware of the complexity and the variety of different opinions within the Church as to how to engage, positively or negatively, with the world around us. Well, again, you might say that a lot of the complexity here is brought about by the First World War. You see, because in the First World War, there was so much religious fervor on one side or the other, so much propaganda, and so much of the belief that God was on our side, or if you were in the German, Austria-Hungary side, you of course believed that God was on your side. And so the propaganda that was employed, and the myth-making that was employed, Stories of special divine providence to save one set of soldiers or another became sort of the hallmark of the First World War. Now, this is important to note because so very often in the modern world right now, it is said that the First World War was the time when everyone lost their faith, that the war itself somehow ruined the faith of Europe and of America. Well, that is certainly true on some level. There was a crisis of faith as a result of the First World War. But I think, as we've already seen, the loss of faith with some people was already there decades or generations before the First World War. The loss of faith, you might say, as a result of the First World War, came at the end of it, when both sides paused to realize how much of the propaganda of their faith had been used by governments to back the enlisting of men for the military or the support financially of all their citizens for the war. And we can cite just one example of this, the Angel of Mons, or the Angel of Mons, if you just want to anglicize it, frankly. But this is a story, an entirely mythical story, of a set of soldiers who were being chased down by the German forces, and who, calling upon St. George, were suddenly saved when a series of angels dressed, at least in some of the stories, as the 15th century Henry V armies who had conquered France before. These archers, these archer angels of all things, showed up and protected the soldiers as they escaped. Well, again, this is entirely myth-making, and this is entirely using some element of the biblical faith, albeit very obscurely so, and weaving it not only into the war as it was going on in their day, but hearkening back to the 15th century war between England and France. It's this type of engagement, this type of muddying up of the waters between culture, politics, nationalism, and religion that is almost impossible at times to disentangle in the First World War. Everywhere you look in the First World War, there is religious propaganda, religious imagery, crucifixes hovering above fields where soldiers lay dead, priests of all kinds out ministering to those who almost seem to want to claw their way into the saving arms of the church, to say nothing of the propaganda against the German Huns, as they were called, in a very sort of slanderous way. The beast Antichrist, who was challenging the opportunity of freedom, in particular religious freedom, and who was seen as the scourge of all that was good and true and beautiful. This level of propaganda and engagement within the church was just simply assumed as something that was allowable and good by the church. And you might say that the First World War is the full epitome of the entanglement, in particular in America, of Christian values with the welfare and the progress of the state itself. The ongoing belief the church was somehow part and parcel to the culture itself, or that it was a supporter of all that was part of the American good, is on display here. And it's true of Catholics and Protestants. The Archbishop of Chicago, for example, the Catholic Archbishop, stressed that all good Catholics should enlist. He also encouraged churches to even consider going into debt to make a display for all of their neighborhoods and their surrounding environs to see that they were supporters of the war. Other Protestant churches did many of the same kinds of things. You begin to see, for example, the flying of the American flag within the sanctuary becoming a more or less common thing. In fact, even the creation of the Pledge of Allegiance itself was begun here in the early 1900s in the context of the run-up to the First World War by a Christian man who believed that patriotism and good Christian virtue were things that were not synonymous, but things that were hand in glove. To be a good American meant to be a good Christian man or something like this. And so he creates the first sort of kernel of what will become the Pledge of Allegiance as we know it today. And in part, what he's saying is, if we can instill in people the heritage of the virtues of the American Republic, then built within that is some of the same kernel, the seeds of a good, biblical, faithful man or woman. The story of those who resisted the First World War, though, of Quakers, the Amish, and the Mennonites in particular, those who were called upon to enlist or who were drafted, and yet who, because of their religious principles, going all the way back to the Reformation and the Anabaptist movement itself, they stood pretty united against the idea that they had to enlist and become part of this war. Many of them were thrown into prison, and they were treated very poorly as a result of standing up for their beliefs that those in the church ought not to so fundamentally identify with the wars of nations that they themselves believed that they could not fight. And so really the story of the Quakers and the Amish and the Mennonites in particular in the First World War is really an undertold story, an underappreciated story about the complexities of the church in a world that is now engaging in something that you might call total war, where every energy, every ounce of strength is being leveraged. All of our money, all of our blood, sweat, and tears goes to the war. And this means that those traditions within Protestantism that do not believe in participating in war or in the army or the military were often being persecuted for their beliefs. In the end, the ongoing struggle of the war came to an end, and as the war drew to a close, many of the propaganda pieces and the slanderous pieces against the Germans and against Europeans as a whole began to come back to the Americans as being superficially based off of a certain amount of racism or anti-German sentiment. And so as a result, Americans had to realize that a lot of their propaganda and a lot of their using of their energies to entangle the church with the First World War were now somewhat embarrassing. And there were a number of people who began to abandon the over-reliance on patriotism as a vehicle for theological and biblical interest within the church. And as we'll see in our next lecture, this leads dramatically into the context of not only the Depression, but the rise of Nazism and the Second World War.